Welcome to my Blender tutorial, which is aimed at those who are interested in using an open source tool to create things for 3D printing. So the first step, I will make sure to load the factory settings. So for everyone who has a fresh install of Blender has the same starting point as I have. First thing that I'm going to do is to adjust a few settings, which I find comfortable to work with. The first is under the input section is to emulate NumPad, because I'm working on a notebook. I don't have any NumPad keys, so by checking this emulate NumPad, the number keys, the top row on your keyboard, will act as if it was the NumPad inside Blender. This is very practical because the NumPad is used to change the orientation of the view that you're working with. And I find that to be very practical to be able to quickly switch from left top and right or bottom views of the object that you're working on. The second changes that I usually do is leave the select with mouse button to the left button. So you left click to select something, but I'm going to change the spacebar action from play to search. So whenever I want to do something, I prefer to use the keyboard and just search for the action that I can do from a certain mode that I'm working on. And that's basically it. So I'm working with a touchpad, so with 2 fingers I can manipulate the angle by swiping across the touchpad. I think when you're using a mouse on Windows, for example, you have to hold down the middle mouse button or the mouse wheel to get the same effect. The first step is to practice to use the settings that I just mentioned. So if I press the number 1 or the 1 key on the numpad, I can see the object from the front. And if I command or control 1 click, you have to play a bit with your Windows layout. I'm not familiar with that one. You can switch from front to back view. And if you press number 3, you have the side views. And what you can notice here is that the red, and the green, and the blue line. This will give you an orientation of the axis. So the easiest way I remember this is that we have red, green, and blue. And I guess you're familiar with the term RGB, so it's red, green, blue is X, Y, Z. So red is the X-axis, green is the Y-axis, and if I go into front view, I can see the blue line here, the Z-axis. So the front view has the Z-axis going from top to bottom, and the side view has the Y-axis going from left to right. Now, and to get into the top view, you press 7. So it's 1, 3, and 7. And if you look at the numpad, this is basically how those keys are located on the numpad according to the X-axis. So you can select the top, the front, the side view. And this helps a lot if you have, for example, additional background images, which you use as a reference when designing an object. And let's get to the space key. The first step that you will always do is when you create a new file or a new Blender file is to delete this, left click to select here to delete this basic cube in the middle. And you just can hit space and type in delete, and it shows you object delete, and the shortcut here is X. Or what you could also do is here, click into the object menu, and then you can see many actions that you can perform on an object. And here I'm going to click on delete, or if I undo it again, I can click X, and then you can see this tiny menu that pops up, and then confirm with the left click or the enter key. But let's undo that. Because we want to model things for 3D printing, we have to have a correct reference of size. And there's an interesting thing that you can do is if you go into edit mode. So object mode is, let's go a few steps back first. Object mode is where you can add objects, import objects, grab them and move them around the 3D space here is. And if you want to modify those objects, you have to press Tab, or you can go into the menu up here and go into edit mode. And by pressing the Tab key, you can quickly switch between those. So if you're building something bigger and you have separated into multiple objects, you can just click one or select multiple objects and then go into edit mode. And you can see here that the object is then editable via selecting edges or vertices. But we'll go into that more detail later. Because what I wanted to show you is this button up here. So you have the two circles, the filled and the half filled circle, and there's a menu to it. And if you go all the way to the bottom, you have this edge length. So if I select this now and I hit A to select all vertices, we can see that all active edges show the length. And this is now showing per default that the edge length is 2 meters. Well, because most of the printers, 3D printers, have a build plate of 20 centimeters, working with meters is not very practical. So I'm going into the scene properties here on the right, and then select this unit subsection and switch the length here from meters to millimeters. Well, this is now 2000 millimeters, which is kind of unpractical. So what my approach is, I'm changing the unit scale to 0.01. So we have our 20 by 20 millimeter default cube. But what we notice is that the guidelines, the grid lines disappeared. So to fix this, I go back into this menu here at the top, go into scale and set it to 0.01. Now if I look at it from the top, if you remember pressing the 7 key, I can see it from the top, and it also shows us here thicker lines for each centimeter and the little bit darker lines for each millimeter, which helps to get an overview of the size of this object. And now that we know that we have set it up this way, we can see this is the default 20 millimeter cube. Now, if we're in edit mode, and what can sometimes happen is that we have way too many vertices on a small scale, and which makes it difficult to see the lengths because the screen gets cluttered. Let me show you in an example. I add a cylinder, and that's fair enough. So let's take the cylinder, move it to the side, and scale it down a bit. You can see we can't see anything here anymore about the lengths, and they disappear as soon as we only select two edges, and we can two vertices, and we can see that only one edge is selected, which has almost a length of 0.5 millimeter. But if everything is selected, which we often use, this gets kind of cluttered. And going all the way into here, maybe if your screen is small, you have to scroll to get to the edge length. It's not that practical. So what I like to do is I right click on this button and add it to the quick favorites here. So if I go back into this view and I press Q to get into the quick favorites, I can quickly toggle this view, those edge lengths. And let's take a look a bit at the UI of Blender. And there's this tab bar here at the top, and when we click on those different modes, we can see that the partition of views and dialogues changes quite a bit depending on what kind of work we want to do with Blender. And you will quickly notice that there's way more modes and things that we can do with Blender than we need for 3D printing. So I'm going to stick to this layout mode and do all the work within this. You might want to switch to modeling because you might not need the playback bar here at the bottom. So let's use modeling for now. And what you can always do is you can rearrange everything to your liking. And you can do this by, if you go with your mouse into the corner of a view and then click and drag, you can create new views. And for example, if you want to create references views from the front view, from the side view, and just keep editing, given your monitor is big enough in this view, you can see here. If you edit this, you can see from the respective perspectives what's happening. Or if you want to create a screencast documenting your work, I usually create a single view from one perspective and keep recording only this view and keep editing on a different one, which makes sure that the mouse is not always going across the screen, and I can rearrange the view and perspective while editing, and the view during the recording doesn't change. If you want to get rid of those views again, you go into the corners again, and then you can drag them into a certain direction to remove the respective view again. And what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to create a new view from the bottom and switch it to text editor. So I can create a new text file here and start making notes. I'm going to call this Paul's cheat sheet. And I'm going to write down the different shortcuts that I'm using and keep adding to this list, so you can use this as a cheat sheet if you want to start using Blender, and especially when you're starting from scratch. So the first that I mentioned is the tab key between edit and object mode. And then once we are in object mode, which is the default mode, we have the key A. So not all the keys have the same effect in object and edit mode, but the A key is select all. And if we quickly tap A 2 times, that's right, that way select none. So if I hover with my mouse above this 3D port and I hit A, we can see here in the scene collection all the objects that are in this scene. The default setup is the cube, a camera and a light, because the origin of Blender is an artistic tool to create 3-dimensional scenes and render them. That's why we have a light and a camera. And if I press A twice quickly, like a double click, I can select none again. If I go into edit mode, I left click to select, hit tab to change the mode. I can do the same. A selects all the vertices, and say double A selects none. If I left click, I can select single vertices, and if I shift left click, I can select multiple. So let's write that down. Left click, select, shift plus left click, select multiple. And you will, the more you use Blender, you will find more and more shortcuts that you can use with the keyboard to select multiple. For example, if I command shift click, it selects all vertices that are on the shortest path from the first that you selected to the last. So, oops, I just wrote shit here, so I'm in shift and command plus left click, select shortest path, and so on. Now if I go back into edit mode and I want to place objects, I can hit the G key to grab them, and I can freely place them with the mouse. So let's write that down, G is grab. Let's see if we can also find that here, grab, no. But you can see it here, move, and you can also use the axis here to move them along an axis. But this is not how I do that, because I'm mainly using the keyboard. So if I want to move this cube here 10 centimeters to the right, I hit the G key, then I hit the X key to restrict the movement along to the X-axis. I can still freely move the mouse and move it along the X-axis, or I can move it along the Y-axis by hitting Y and Z. And this is on the X-axis, and you can see the top left corner here, the amount that you're moving. But if I start typing in numbers now, 10, you can see that I moved the object by 10 millimeters along the X-axis. And if I hit enter, the object has been moved by 10 millimeters to the right. The same works in edit mode. If I select this corner vertex here, I hit grab, I can freely move this vertex or align the movement to a given axis, X, Y, front and back, Z, top and bottom, grab, X, and then 10. I can move it by 10 millimeters along the X-axis, and we have this misshapen cube here. So grab, then X, Y, Z, restrict along axis, grab, then numbers, move by a given amount. So in theory, we can already do everything that we want with this, but it's kind of tedious because we have to move every single object or every single vertex itself. And I have no idea where I went here. Anyhow, so this is moving things in the object view and edit view. One thing that you have to keep in mind is that the way I'm using Blender is just the way that I figured out works best for me, or is the way that I can remember the rest. This doesn't mean that this is the best way of modifying objects or meshes in general. So I highly recommend that you watch the official tutorials and many other tutorials that you can find on YouTube and check those out and see which way works best for you. So let's get back into something I said earlier. So editing every vertex by hand is kind of tedious. What I wanted to say with that was that I think the most powerful features in Blenders are modifiers. So what are modifiers? I will give you an example. Let's say we want to modify a box, a container. And I think one of the most common things to print is containers, cases, or anything that holds something or puts it into the right place. So let's pretend we want to create a tiny box that has the size of 20 by 20 millimeters. So how would I do that? So first of all, I can select the top face. So something that I missed to explain is those three buttons here. They are to define which way of selecting things in the 3D edit space should work. So the first is selecting vertices, those points in space here, or edges, which are connections between points in space, or faces, which are between the edges, basically. So this is one-dimensional, zero-dimensional, one-dimensional, and two-dimensional. So let's select the top face, and then remember, hit X to delete. Let's write that down, X, delete. And I delete that. And now it gets a little bit more complicated because Blender now wants to know what do you want to delete. All the edges, all the vertices. So if I delete vertices, well, most of the cube disappears. So let's undo that. Right. I can't see my keyboard. That's why. No, I'm missing. Ah, that's why. Delete here, and I have to go into the right view. No. What the fuck? You can see Blender can be kind of confusing from time to time. Interesting. So apparently the undo history includes also the text view instead of just undoing in the text view. So you will have to get used to learning a lot more with Blender every day. So delete. Now, if I go back here, hit X, and I want to only delete the face, you can see only the lid basically got deleted. Now, if I want to, so if I look at this now, this box here, the thickness of the walls is basically 0. So what I like to do is give it a solidify modifier to make this object more solid. And let's say we want this object to have a wall thickness of 4 perimeters. So I know my nozzle size is 0.4 millimeters, and I want 4 perimeters. So I just type in 0.4 times 4. It does the calculation, which is 0.6 millimeters, and makes those walls thicker. So you can also tell Blender to which direction this should be added. So now the inside walls, the walls are created towards the inside. If I change the direction here to 1, we can see that the walls are added to the outside. Go back to -1. Oops. Type in -1. They're added to the inside. Let's keep it to the inside so that the outside of the object remains by 20 by 20 millimeters. How can we verify this? So if I click on this tiny arrow here on the side, we can get this menu here, and it shows us some context information, and it shows us the dimension of this object is 20 by 20 millimeters still. So if I change this modifier, the offset to 1, we can see the dimensions are a bit bigger. You can see it's not really an even number here. So what I like to do is select even thickness, which kind of makes the modification into an intuitive way I would expect it to. I'm not quite sure what the difference between non-even and even thickness is, but I always make sure to select even thickness here. So let's turn this back to -1. Okay, so what else could we do with modifiers? One thing I noticed with my printers is that edges really never turn out to be edges like that, and I would like to make them rounder. So I do this, but I go back into edit mode, and here in the top left, go to edge select mode, and with shift left click, I select all those edges. And we can see we still have this context menu here, and I can modify the context data that is attached to the things that I have currently selected. So, and one of this context data that I want to edit is the bevel weight, I don't know, and set this to 1. So first, nothing happened, because we still need to do something with this information. You can see that those edges have turned blue, so we can see in the 3D viewport that something has changed on those edges. Let's put it that way. And I go into the modifiers and select the Bevel-Modifier, and I make sure to move it up. So in this rounding modifier is applied first. Then I go into the limit method. I'm not going to choose angle, I'm going to choose weight, because if we remember, we have changed this bevel weight here. And the amount of the beveling that we want to do is I'm going to set it to 2 millimeters. And we can see the amount of how the edges are shortened increases. And I'm going to use, let's say, 11 segments, so we have 12 faces. Now we can see that those corners are beautifully round. And what I mentioned earlier is we don't want to modify each vertex manually. Is by using modifiers we can easily change the appearance of the object, the shape of the object, without actually really editing things manually in the view space, but by having those calculated on demand by those modifiers in my Blender. So this now we could print this now, and we would have a tiny box with the size of 20 millimeters. So let's keep working with modifiers. If you go here into add, we can see that we have many different things that we can add to the viewport. And by scaling this thing down, we can see we have this monkey, which is some legacy historical object that you will see in many tutorials on YouTube. And or we can add text. So if I go into top view, we can see the text. If I press tab, go into edit mode and just call this, I'll give this label X. And by hitting the G key, I can move it. And then by using the R key and typing -90, I can rotate it. So I just use the new key. So R is rotate. And rotate has the same behavior like the G key for moving. We can rotate around then by hitting X, Y, and Z, the X, Y, and Z axis, and or then adding numbers. So this is what I did. I just selected it and then rotated around the X axis by 10 degrees, 100 degrees, and or Y axis, Z axis. You can see the rotation changes. And so what I also just hit was escape, cancel ongoing modification. And so yeah, what can we do with this? So I'm going to add a modifier to this add, and we'll give it the Solidify-Modifier and give it a thickness of, let's say, 0.5 millimeters. And if I go into top view, I can see it is now at a thickness of 0.5 millimeters. And let's see, now the origin of each object is this tiny orange ball that you can see here. So if I select this object, we can see the origin is in the center. In this case, the origin is in the bottom left. So why is this origin interesting? So if we're in object mode and we move an object, we actually move the origin of the object. And if we're in edit mode and we move an edge, we move this edge in relation to the origin of this object. And so if I move this a little bit to the left, go back into edit mode, we can see that the location of this axis here is still at x10, y -10. If I move it further to the right, this is still the same. So those coordinates during edit mode are all in relation to the object's origin. And when I'm in object mode, everything is in relation to the world origin, which I can set back to 0 here manually again. So if we look at this and we want to center it, we need to make sure that the object's origin is in the center. So I can go into this by pressing space into the search bar. Let's go back here and space search actions. So I'm going back here, space, and I'm going to search what can I do with origin. I can see here object, set origin, and I can say set origin to geometry, which I need to select something first. Let's go back. It still has the previous action selected, origin to geometry. And we can see now that this orange dot has moved into the middle of the geometry that is defined by this X. Now, we can see the context information here. We want to move this to the center. We know we can just go 0 on the x-axis and 0 on the y-axis. If we go to front view, we can see now that this X is perfectly centered in the middle. If we go into edit mode, we can still change it, but if we have a different character, this would change. So what we can do now is we can scale this. And if we can scale this in object mode, let's go back to the first cube here. For example, here the location is 10 minus 10. If we scale this by 2, let's go back to the cheat sheet. I just mentioned scaling and I was hitting the S key to scale. So as scaling, and scaling works the same way as rotating and grabbing with the X, Y, Z constraints in the number. So let's say we want to scale this along the Z axis. Hit S, Z, we can see the blue line becomes active and I enter 2. We can scale this by the factor of 2 along the Z axis. And if I go back into edit mode, those coordinates are still the same because the scaling is done in object mode and not in edit mode. So let's undo this. So I'm scaling this thing here in object mode by the factor of 1.8. I can do this by just inting here 1.8, 1.8, 0.8. And if we look from the top, you can see this is now thicker than the 0.5 millimeters that I've used earlier. So I can modify this back to not scaling the y-axis. Oops, axis. I got confused here because the object is rotated along the x-axis, so I should be using the y-axis, the z-axis here. So this is now correctly at 0.5 millimeters. Now, what's also interesting is snapping. So we can snap by increment. What does that mean? Let's select our cube and we select this edge here. We can view it from the top, which means we can also see our grid of millimeters. If I grab and move this, nothing restricts the movement. But if I want to move in 1 millimeter steps, which is the grid size that we define, if I hit the Control key, the movement snap this to the grid that's defined. Which helps a lot if you want to move things just by a couple of millimeters. So, and now why am I talking about snapping is because I want to snap this object onto this surface here. So what I want to do here now is I'm going to switch this to Vertex and then grab this object, then grab it along the y-axis, hold the Control key and snap it to this object here. And if we look at it now, we can see it's flush onto this object. Now this is not my final goal. Because I know this is 0.5 millimeters thick, I'm going to manually move this along the y-axis, grab y.4 and insert this by 0.4 millimeters into this surface. Let's get back to modifiers. I'm going to grab this cube here and I'm going to add a new modifier, a Boolean modifier. And the Boolean modifications are basically intersection or cutting modes between different objects. So this thing is called text. We can double click here in the object list and call it bool-x. If I select the cube again into the Boolean modifier, I can select an object here and my expectation is that it shows up here. It doesn't. The reason is because this is not really an object. This is a text, which I can still edit. So what I need to do is convert this somehow to mesh. So I just searched for convert because I wanted to convert it. And it shows me I have the option to convert this into a mesh. Now this is a mesh. And if I go back into this modifier, I can select it. So the selection that I want to do is difference. And I can't still see anything because, well, this object is still filling the hole that we cut into this wall. And what we can do is, if we go into this list here, click on this eye icon here, and we can see the X has disappeared, and we have the X inserted into this wall here of our cube. And this might look familiar to the X, Y, Z calibration cube that you have printed at some point and now you're creating your own, but in this case it's hollow inside. And I've done all this by not moving mesh pixels around, but by using modifiers to, well, let's say mathematically enhance this. And this is great because if you want to change the amount or the size of the rounding, if you want to print an XYZ calibration cylinder, you can change these properties without fiddling with the mesh too much. So far so good. Well, how do we print this now? We select with left click this object, go into File, Export, STL, and at this point it's very important that you hit the selection only and then export this STL file.